Good morning, friends. But even for the newcomer, whom the transit prison cracks open and shucks, it is very, very necessary. It gives him some gradual preparation for camp life. Such a change all in one step would be more than the heart could bear. His consciousness would be unable to orient itself in that murk all at once. It has to happen gradually. Then, too, the transit prison gave the prisoner the semblance of communicating with home. It was there he wrote his first letter he was permitted to, reporting that he hadn't been shot, and sometimes the direction of his prisoner transport, and these were always the very first unfamiliar words home of a man who had been plowed over by interrogation. At home they continued to remember him as he had been, but he would never be that person again, and that could suddenly, like a stroke of lightning, become apparent in one or another clumsily written line. Clumsily written because, even though letters could be sent from transit prisons and there was a mailbox in the yard, it was impossible to get either paper or pencils, or anything to sharpen a pencil with. However, a makorka wrapper, or one from a sugar packet, could turn up and be smoothed out, and someone in this cell would have a pencil, and so lines would be written in an undecipherable scrawl, which would determine the family's future peace or discord. Women, driven out of their minds by receiving such a letter, would sometimes precipitately rush off and try to get to their husbands at the transit prison, even though visits were never allowed, and they would have succeeded only in burdening him with things. One such woman provided, in my opinion, the theme for a monument to all wives, and even indicated the place for it. This was in the Kubyshev transit prison in 1950. The prison was situated in a low-lying area from which, however, the Ziguli gates of the Volga River could be seen, and right above the prison, bordering it on the east, rose a high, long, grassy hill. It was outside the camp compound and above it, and from the inside and down below we couldn't see the approach to it. Very rarely did anyone ever appear up there, although sometimes goats were pastured there or children played. And one cloudy summer day a city woman appeared on its ridge. Shading her eyes with her hand and barely moving, she began to scan our compound from above. At the time, three heavily populated cells were taking their outdoor walk in 3 separate exercise yards. And there in the abyss, among those 300 depersonalized ants, she hoped to catch sight of her man. Did she hope that her heart would tell her which one he was? In all probability they had refused to allow her a visit with him, and so she had climbed that hill. Everyone noticed her from the courtyards, and everyone stared at her. Down below in the hollow there was no wind, but it was blowing hard up above. It made her long dress, her jacket, and her long hair stream out and billow, expressing all that love and anxiety which possessed her. I think that a statue of such a woman, right there on that spot on the hill overlooking the transit prison, with her face to the Ziguli gates, just as she actually stood, might explain at least a little something to our grandchildren. She was there for a long time, and they didn't drive her off, probably because the guards were too lazy to climb the hill, but finally a soldier climbed up and began to shout and wave his arms at her, and chased her away. The transit prison also gives the prisoner some kind of overall view, some breadth of outlook. As they say, even though there's nothing to eat, it's still a gay life. In the incessant traffic here, in the comings and goings of dozens and hundreds of people, in the frankness of the stories and conversations. In camp, they don't talk so freely because they're always afraid they're of stepping into the trap of the oper, the security officer. You are refreshed, you are aired out, you become more lucid, and you begin to understand better what is happening to you, to your people, even to the world. Even one single eccentric who turns up in your cell can tell you things you'll never in your life read about. All of a sudden they introduce into the cell some kind of miracle, a tall, young military man with a Roman profile, curly and unclipped flaxen locks, in a British uniform, just as if he had come straight from the Normandy landing, an officer of the invading army. He enters as proudly as if he expected everyone to rise to their feet in his presence. And it turns out that he had simply not expected to be among friends at this point. He had already been in prison for 2 years, but he had never yet been in a cell, and he had been brought secretly right to the transit prison itself, in an individual Stolypin compartment. And then, unexpectedly, either by mistake or else with special intent, he had been admitted to our common stable. He looked around the cell, saw a Wehrmacht officer there in German uniform, and started to argue with him in German. And there they were arguing heatedly, ready, it seemed, to resort to weapons if they'd had any. 5 years had passed since the war, and it had been drummed into us that in the West the war had been waged only for the sake of appearances, and to us it was strange to observe their mutual outrage. The German had been with us for a long time, and we Russians hadn't argued with him. For the most part, we had laughed with him. No one would have believed the story of Erik Arvid Anderson, had it not been for his unshorn locks, a miracle unique in all the Gulag, and that foreign bearing of his and his fluent English, German, and Swedish speech. According to him, he was the son of a rich Swede, not merely a millionaire, but a billionaire. Well, let's assume he embellished a little. On his mother's side, he was a nephew of the British General Robertson, who commanded the British zone in occupied Germany. A Swedish subject, he had served as a volunteer in the British Army and had actually landed in Normandy, and after the war he had become a Swedish career officer. However, the investigation of social systems remained one of his principal interests. His thirst for socialism was stronger than his attachment to his father's capital. He looked upon Soviet socialism with feelings of profound sympathy, and he had even had the chance to become convinced of its flourishing state with his own eyes when he had come to Moscow as a member of a Swedish military delegation. They had been given banquets and taken to country homes, and there they had encountered no obstacles at all to establishing contact with ordinary Soviet citizens, with pretty actresses who for some reason had never had to rush off to work, and who willingly spent time with them, even tete-a-tete, and thus convinced once and for all of the triumph of our social system. Erik, on his return to the West, wrote articles in the press defending and praising Soviet socialism. And this proved to be his undoing. In those very years, in 1947 and 48, they were roping in from all sorts of nooks and crannies progressive young Westerners prepared to renounce the West publicly, and it appeared that if they could only have collected another dozen or so, the West would shudder and collapse. Erik's newspaper articles caused him to be regarded as suitable for this category. At the time he was serving in West Berlin, and he had left his wife in Sweden, and out of pardonable male weakness he used to visit an unmarried German girl in East Berlin, and it was there that he was bound and gagged one night. And is not this the significance of the proverb which says, he went to see his cousin and he ended up in prison? This had probably been going on for a long time, and he wasn't the first. They took him to Moscow, then Gromyko, who had once dined at his father's home in Stockholm and who knew the son also, not only returned the hospitality but proposed to the young man that he renounce publicly both capitalism and his own father. And in return he was promised full and complete capitalist maintenance to the end of his days here in our country. But to Gromyko's surprise, although Erik would not have suffered any material loss, he became indignant and uttered some very insulting words. Since they didn't believe in his strength of mind, they locked him up in the dock outside Moscow, fed him like a prince in a fairy tale. Sometimes they used awful methods of repression on him. They refused to accept his orders for the following day's menu, and instead of the spring chicken he ordered, they simply brought him a steak, just like that. Surrounded him with the works of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and waited a year for him to be re-educated. To their surprise, it didn't happen. At that point, they quartered with him a former lieutenant general who had already served 2 years in Norilsk. They probably calculated that by relating the horrors of camp, the lieutenant general would persuade Erik to surrender. But either he carried out that assignment badly, or else he didn't want to carry it out. After 10 months of their being in prison together, the only thing he had taught Erik was broken Russian, and he had bolstered Erik's growing repugnance for the Blue Caps. In the summer of 1950, they once more summoned Erik to Vyshinsky, and he once more refused. In so doing, he made existence contingent on consciousness, thereby violating all the Marxist-Leninist rules. And then Abakumov himself read Erik the decree, 20 years in prison. What for? They themselves already regretted having gotten mixed up with this ignoramus, but at the same time they couldn't release him and let him go back to the West, and so they transported him in a separate compartment. And it was there that he had heard the story of the Moscow girl through the partition, and seen through the train window in the dawn light the rotting straw-thatched roofs of the age-old Russia of Ryazan. Those 2 years had very strongly confirmed him in his loyalty to the West. He believed blindly in the West. He did not want to recognize its weaknesses. He considered Western armies unbeatable and Western political leaders faultless. He refused to believe to believe us when we told him that during the period of his imprisonment, Stalin had begun a blockade of Berlin and had gotten away with it perfectly well. Eric's milky neck and creamy cheeks blushed with indignation whenever we ridiculed Churchill and Roosevelt. And he was also certain that the West would not countenance his, Eric's, imprisonment, that on the basis of information from the Kubyshev transit prison, the Western Intelligence Services would immediately learn that Eric had not drowned in the Spree River, but had been imprisoned in the Soviet Union, and either he would be ransomed or someone would be exchanged for him. This faith of his in the individual importance of his own fate among other prisoners' fates was reminiscent of our own well-intentioned Orthodox Soviet communists. Notwithstanding our heated arguments, he invited my friend and me to Stockholm whenever we could come. Everyone knows us there, he said with a tired smile. My father virtually maintained the Swedish king's whole court. For the time being, however, the son of the billionaire had nothing to dry himself with, and I presented him with an extra tattered towel as a gift, and soon they took him away on a prisoner transport. And the movement of people was endless. Prisoners were brought in and taken away, singly and in groups, and driven off in prisoner transports. Appearing so businesslike on the surface, so planned, this movement was marked by such stupidity that one can hardly believe it. In 1949, the special camps were created, and then and there, on the basis of some summit decision, masses of women were driven from camps in the European North and the Transvolga area, through the Sverdlovsk transit prison, to Siberia, to Taichet, to Ozerlag. But in 1950, someone found it convenient to assemble all the women not in Ozerlag, but in Dubrovlag, in Temnikov, in Mordovina. And all those same women, enjoying all the conveniences of Gulag travel, were dragged through this same Sverdlovsk transit prison to the west. In 1951, new special camps were set up in Kemerovo province, Komishlag, and that turned out to be where the women's labor was required, and those ill-fated women were again put in the torment of being sent to the Kemerovo camps through that same accursed Sverdlovsk transit prison. The time came for liberation, but not for all of them. All those women who were left to drag out their terms in the midst of the general Khrushchev relaxation were once again swung out of Siberia through the Sverdlovsk transit prison into Mordovina. It was thought better to have them all together. Well, after all, we have our own self-contained economy. The isles are all our own, and the distances aren't so very great for a Russian. And the same sort of thing happened to individual Czechs, the more unfortunate ones. Shendrik was a big, merry, open-faced fellow, and he labored honestly, as they say, in one of the Kubyshev camps, and had no intimation of the evil fate overtaking him. But this evil fate struck nonetheless. An urgent order arrived at the camp, not just from anybody, but from the Minister of Internal Affairs himself. And how could the minister know of Shendrik's existence? The order was to deliver this Shendrik to prison number 18 in Moscow immediately. They grabbed him, dragged him off to the Kubyshev transit prison, and from there to Moscow with no delay. But not to some prison number 18. Instead, with all the rest, he went to the widely known Krasnaya Presnya prison. Shendrik didn't know about any prison number 18. No one had told him. But his misfortune did not drowse. No more than 2 days had passed before they jerked him onto a prisoner transport again, and this time took him all the way to Pekora. The landscape outside the train window grew ever sparser and grimmer. Shendrik was alarmed. He knew there was an order from the minister, and here they were rapidly hauling him off to the north. And that meant that the minister had some awful evidence against him. In addition to all the other torments of the trip, they stole 3 days of bread rations from him while he was en route, and by the time he got to Pekora, he was staggering. Pekora greeted him inhospitably. They drove him out to work in the wet snow, hungry and unsettled. In 2 days he had never had a chance to dry out his shirts, or even a chance to stuff his mattress with pine needles. And right then they ordered him to turn in everything he had that was government issue, and once again they scooped him up and whisked him still further to Vorkuta. It seemed quite evident that everything that had happened, that the minister was determined to destroy Shendrik, and not him alone, but the entire group in his prisoner transport. In Vorkuta they didn't touch Shendrik for a whole month. He went out to general assignment work, even though he had not yet recovered from his travels, but he had begun to reconcile himself to this Arctic fate. And then suddenly one day they called him out of the mine and chased him off breathless to the camp to turn in everything that he had that was government issue. And in 1 hour's time he was being carried off to the south. Now by this time it had already begun to smell of personal vengeance. They took him to Moscow prison number 18. They held him in the cell there for 1 month. And then he was summoned to some lieutenant colonel who asked him, "Where the hell have you been? Are you really a mechanical engineer?" And Chandra confessed that he was. And then they took him off to none other than, yes, the Paradise Islands. Yes, there are such islands in the Archipelago. This coming and going of people, these destinies and these stories greatly enliven the transit prisons. And the old camp veterans advise newcomers, lie down and take it easy. They feed you the guaranteed minimum here, and you don't have to tire your back. And when it's not crowded, you can sleep as much as you want to. So just stretch out and lie there from one handout of gruel to the next. The food is sparse, but the sleeping is good. Only those who know what general assignment work is in the camps will understand that a transit prison is a rest home, a happiness on our path. And one more advantage, too, when you sleep in the daytime, the hours pass more quickly. If you can just kill off the day, the night will go away on its own. True, recalling that labor created the human being, and that only labor can reform the criminal, and sometimes having auxiliary projects, and sometimes acting as subcontractors in order to keep up their financial end, the bosses of transit prisons might sometimes even drive their loafing transit manpower out to labor. The work at that same cotless transit prison before the war was not the least bit easier than in a regular camp. In the course of a winter day, 6 or 7 weakened prisoners were harnessed to a tractor sledge, and had to drag it 7 miles along the Dvina River up to the mouth of the Vychegda. They got stuck in snow and fell down, and the sledges got stuck. And it would seem that any work more wearing and debilitating could hardly have been thought up. But it turned out that this wasn't the actual work, but merely the warm-up. There, at the mouth of the Vychegda, they had to load 13 cubic yards of firewood on the sledges, and the same people harnessed in the same way. Repin was no longer with us, and this is no subject for our new artists. It is merely a crude reproduction from nature. Had to haul the sledges back to their transit prison home. Now what does a camp have to offer after that? You wouldn't even survive to get there. The work brigade leader for that task was Kolupayev, and the workhorses were electrical engineer Dmitriev, quartermaster corps Lieutenant Colonel Belyayev, and Vasily Vlasov, who is already familiar to us, but not all the other names can be collected at this date. During the war, the Arzamas transit prison fed its prisoners beet tops, and at the same time put them to work on a permanent basis. There were garment shops, a footgear felting shop, where woolen fibers were fulled in hot water and acids. In the summer of 1945, we went out to the stiflingly stagnant cells of Krasnaya Presnya to work as volunteers, for the right to breathe the air the whole day long, for the right to sit unhurried and unhindered in a quiet plank latrine, an incentive that is often overlooked, heated by the August sun, and these were the days of Potsdam and Hiroshima, listening to the peaceful buzzing of a lonely bee, and last, for the right to get an extra quarter-pound of bread at night. They took us to the wharves of the Moscow River, where timber was being unloaded. It was our job to roll the logs off some of the piles, carry them over, and stack them on other piles. We spent a good deal more strength than we received extra food and compensation. Nonetheless, we enjoyed going out to work there. I often have to blush at my recollections of my younger years, and that's where my younger years were spent. But whatever casts you down also teaches you a lot. And it turned out that as a residue of the officers' shoulder boards, which had trembled and fluttered on my shoulders for 2 years in all, some kind of poisonous golden dust had settled in the empty space between my ribs. And on that river wharf, which was a camplet too, there was also a compound with watchtowers surrounding it. We were merely transient, temporary work-sloggers, and there had been no talk at all, no rumor that we might be allowed to stay and serve out our terms there. But when they formed us up for the first time, and the work assignment foreman looked down on the line to pick out temporary work brigade leaders, my worthless heart was bursting under my woolen field shirt. Me, pick me. I was not chosen. But why did I want it? I would only have made further shameful mistakes. How hard it is to part with power. This one has to understand. Have a good day, friends.